Despite Oregon having completed just 3 of their 15 spring practices so far, the spring transfer portal period comes knocking. Portal opening up in right around 2 weeks. But as far as additions go during this portal period for the Ducks, less is more. Dan Lanning has fielded some fantastic teams in his 3 years as Oregon football head coach, but team number 4 in 2025, there's a case to be made that might be the best of them all. And I'm going to answer the elephant in the room. Why does Big Ten Ted have a dedicated Oregon show? That and much more on a stacked edition of That Show Out West.
This place has everything. In fact, the grass is damn green in Eugene.
That performance deserves a holy wallawa.
It's a feeling you cannot explain.
This place is louder than any other venue in the Big Ten.
This program is staged to compete and to win championships.
Welcome to the Big Ten, Oregon.
Welcome to That Show Out West for That Team Out West, an unbiased, neutral observer's view of Oregon Ducks football. I'm Ted LaRue. Boy, we're getting into a little bit of a rhythm here to open up some of these shows, right? We're getting into a little bit of a tradition, creating a little bit of a tradition, starting by getting in our covered wagons, getting in our stagecoaches, headed to Oregon City on the Oregon recruiting trail. Now, lately, Oregon has been in some recruitments, in some big-time battles, and maybe things exactly haven't been going their way lately. Let's start first with the news. That was no joke on April Fool's Day, the worst holiday of them all. Chris Henry Jr. locking in and shutting down his recruitment right now. He posted on Twitter where he's got a graphic in scarlet and gray Ohio State gear saying, officially shutting my recruitment down. I'm 100% locked in and ready to work. This was going to be a very tall task for the Oregon Ducks to be able to complete this flip, but you kind of looked at Chris and things were there was some steam forming, maybe as far as smoke really starting to come out of the momentum that Chris Henry Jr. Or that Oregon was making in the Chris Henry Jr. recruitment. But this kind of came as a little bit of a surprise considering, he was on campus for their junior day. I think he took one visit also fairly recently. So he was getting on campus a good amount at the University of Oregon fairly recently. But when you're recruiting a top-level wide receiver against the Ohio State Buckeyes, you got to bring the house, as they say on the CFB 25 video game, right? There's a lot of resources that come, a lot of points that come when you bring the house. Certainly, like you look at their recruiting. You look at Jeremiah Smith lately, Marvin Harrison Jr., Chris Olave, Garrett Wilson. Carnell Tate and Brandon Ennis were both top 5 wide receivers in their respective recruiting class. There's a reason why they are wide receiver U. Right? If you're a top-level wide receiver, it's very difficult to turn down this Ohio State program. Like Chris Henry Jr. had been saying, as long as Brian Hartline is there, that he was going to be locked in with Ohio State. And now Brian Hartline is the freaking offensive coordinator over there. So maybe that takes it certainly to a different level. But this was going to be a significant challenge, I think, to begin with. And this is probably the expected result, I think, that we all expected. It's just maybe a little bit earlier than I certainly anticipated. But when you look at the wide receiver position for the Oregon Ducks, it's going to be fine. You've got 2 very high-level 5-star talents coming in as true freshmen over the next 2 years. Of course, we know all about DeCorian Moore, the number 1 wide receiver in his recruiting class coming into the Ducks this season. He's expected to come on and make a pretty significant impact as a true freshman, like Ryan Williams, like Jeremiah Smith. We've certainly covered that before here on this show. And then you got Gatlin Bair coming off of a Mormon mission, a former 5-star, like a top 30 overall player in the country in his class. He's going to be a true freshman in 2026. So you've got the high-level wide receivers coming in as true freshmen these next 2 years. Now it's really time to start really building that depth. We saw a 4-star Jeremiah McClellan, who they flipped from Ohio State, really come in as a freshman, and we saw him sparingly this year. He's really expected to slide in to a bigger role. And you look at what Cooper Perry, who's coming in as a true freshman out of the state of Arizona, is another one of those 4-star guys that they really expect to build some depth with at the wide receiver position. You look at guys in this recruiting class like Jalen Lott, Caden Dixon-White is another guy. That's the modern-day teammate of Chris Henry Jr., and he really turned some heads at a recent 7-on-7 camp over there. So he might be really starting to climb up some recruiting boards right now. And Oregon in a great position for both of those guys, certainly right now. And then, now is the time with spring practice really resuming, coming off of this break for Oregon, where you're going to start seeing more players on campus. Messiah Hampton out of the state of New York is another one of those guys, a 4-star wide receiver, top 250 overall player in the country, 6'1", 180 pounds. Like, if Oregon can take home 2 of these guys, and you combine them with Gatlin Bear also coming in this class, basically as a 2026 guy coming off the mission, as we previously mentioned, you start to like that. That's still a pretty good wide receiver, if you want to call it a haul right there. But it's certainly a really good wide receiver group. Let's kind of go to some other unfortunate news that has now been completed. That, of course, being now the completed flip of Tomahini Tapoy. I think that was April Fool's Day as well. Not the best day, certainly, for Oregon on the recruiting trail. But we press on, certainly, as he really completes that flip over there. Now, I'm not really going to touch on this anymore. I know that, Max said on the last show of TSOW, hey, this one's going to go all the way down to the wire, and it certainly could, but I'm really focusing on what next and what now right now for the Ducks. Like on the defensive line, I know there's been 2 decommitments. Of course, the Bot Mulatalo switching to offensive line for some reason, but I think the focus right now, like if you're Oregon and where you stand from a defensive line perspective, it's you just need to keep on doing what you're doing on the football field. Okay? Like, Derek Harmon is going to be a first-round NFL draft pick. Yes, I know. Michigan State, and he certainly played a good amount of his career in East Lansing. But, hey, I'm going to put on my Big Ten Ted hat here for a minute and say there was a lot of things that happened at Oregon that allowed him to vault into the first round of the NFL draft. Like, Mateo Uiagalelei just led the Big Ten in sacks. First team all Big Ten. He could be a top 15 or a top 10 NFL draft pick. So you could have back-to-back first-round defensive linemen. And like what Bear Alexander's doing all the right things right now with the Ducks as well, whether it's this next year or a couple of years down the road and he exhumes all of his eligibility, Bear Alexander can be a first-round or a second-round NFL draft pick. So you just need to keep on doing what you're doing. They're doing a really good job on the defensive line. Like Amari Washington is expected to be another one of those guys to make a big step up. I'm very pleased, I think, with the development and what's happening with guys that come in on the defensive line. So you just got to keep on doing that. But Oregon may shift their priorities in terms of recruitment because I still think that you're going to need another defensive lineman in this class, a defensive tackle in this class. Watch out for Deuce Geralds out of the state of Georgia right now. He just cut down his list to 10. Oregon did indeed make the top 10 right now. He would be the highest ranked defensive lineman in the class for Oregon if they can somehow pull him out of the Southeast. Maybe a little bit late to the party, but hey, we've seen Oregon kind of pull some of these things off certainly in the past before. Defensive line now to offensive line. This is a very modern day heavy segment. Chris Henry Jr., Tomahini Tapoy, Caden Dixon-Wyatt mentioned in this one. Cody Green, USC, Texas, Washington continue to push hard for him, according to Chad Simmons of On3. This was one of my must-sign recruits. And I am considering the talent at the offensive tackle position in this class. I am so invested in getting Green and then maybe Jackson Cantwell or Emmanuel Iheanacho. That would be fantastic. That would be a chef's kiss of recruiting if they can kind of lock down both those guys right now. It sounds like Cody is going to take a few of these visits right now to some of these aforementioned schools that are in this battle, and then he's going to really lock down a final decision, hopefully shut down his recruitment and really lock into the Oregon Ducks. Now, I know USC is pushing really hard for him. Now, although he goes to Mater Dei down there in Santa Ana, he is not a local Southern California kid, right? He grew up in the Pacific Northwest. So as far as the hometown factor goes, and he's going to school down there, but he certainly grew up in the Pacific Northwest, I think in the state of Washington. So that maybe fits, in this case, a little bit closer to the Oregon Ducks. Boy, the more I really start to look into this defense, the more I absolutely love this defense. And this might become a little bit of a theme as the weeks go by, as the months go by, but really as I start to break down each player, each position group a little bit more and a little bit more, I just tend to love it that much more and that much more. My good buddy Dale Bliss over at Autzen Zoo really beat me to the punch and talked about Bryce Boettcher and Dillon Thieneman maybe being one of the best defensive combinations in the entire country. And now that's a strong statement, but it's a very valid statement. So go check out his piece. I'll link it in the description below here on YouTube and podcast. But right now, those guys, the reason why I really love this defense is really because of that combination at linebacker and at safety in the defensive backfield, as we know. These are high-level standard setters at positions where there's inexperience. Like, these are guys that have not only played a few seasons, that have that experience, that have a lot of snaps under their belt, but they've played high level of football. And like, you specifically look at linebacker. Let's start first with that one and Bryce Boettcher, coming off of a season where he was second team All Big Ten. Now, you have Devin Jackson that we believe is going to play next to Bryce Boettcher. He really stepped up and played more last year, pound for pound, maybe one of the fastest guys, maybe the fastest guy on this Oregon football team. But you look really beyond that. You look to the Dylan Williams, the Kamar Matudis, the Braden Platt. There's not a ton of snaps there, right? There's not a ton of experience as it currently stands in that room. So to be able to have somebody like Bryce Boettcher, and we know his story, local Eugene kid, double walk-on, and he said in his press conference, hey, I'm coming back to take care of business. I was motivated by what happened in the Rose Bowl. 1 year of eligibility remaining. I don't know if I could have lived with myself if I would have just let that sit on the table and head over to spring training. So let's talk about the whole baseball and football thing. This is usually a time of year when Oregon's baseball season is starting up with Bryce Boettcher out there in center field. You got to be nimble out there. You got to be able to cover all the grass out there in center field. And this is time where he maybe slims down a little bit and really focuses on his speed. But now that he's able to focus on football, he's really able to really bulk up into a big-time Big Ten linebacker.
The biggest difference is just his body, right? He's always been a guy that's wanted to have a little bit more size at the linebacker position. And when you're playing baseball and running bases and running around in center field, sometimes that's a little bit harder. The weight lift regiment is a little bit different. So just the ability to get those extra reps and put the weight on that's necessary for him to play at a high level.
This offseason, it was like my first winter that I haven't been doing baseball, where usually I drop about 10 pounds for baseball season. I put on about 10 pounds, so I'm sitting around 230 right now, which I think is great. If I'm able to move and do everything I can at 230, that, it'll just be beneficial to me. So, just developing as a football player, whether it's in the weight room and, mentally in the film room, I have more time.
I think that we're going to see the best that Bryce Boettcher has to offer. I think focusing on football for this one season, like we saw him take a very significant jump last season. I think we're going to see yet another jump here in his last season of eligibility. Like, if he can maintain that speed while putting on that extra muscle, that's just going to make him an even better linebacker. This is the year where he's able to really focus on football, that he is going to grow into not only one of the Big Tens, but one of college football's best linebacker, and you love to see that, certainly in the middle of that defense. Let's head over to the defensive backfield. Ooh, I get excited about Dillon Thieneman. It's very interesting when I kind of hear, whether it's other Oregon shows or other Oregon fans, and that they kind of hear things from people and hear things from coaches and how excited they are from a guy like Dillon. I kind of look around and say, yeah, I mean, having watched Big Ten football and doing the Big Ten TED stuff, I know what kind of talent Dillon Thieneman is. Like, he came onto campus year number 1 at Purdue, and he was a freshman All-American. Okay, 100 tackles in each of his 2 seasons over there in West Lafayette, Indiana. Like, outside of Caleb Downs, he's probably the best safety in all of college football right now. Like, he is going to be a tremendously important piece to this defense. But I think the biggest part, and what coaches have said, and what other players have said, and what insiders have said, is just the work ethic that he brings to the table and the example that he sets in the building.
This guy is an absolute pro with preparation. So he's an individual that's in here, early, leaving late. He's wanting to do bonus meetings. The millisecond he kind of made this decision to come here, the process really started of, let's learn this defense. So
professionalism is a perfect way to put it. And whether it's, like this morning I was in the treatment room at 5:50, and he was already in the tubs, shirt off, warming up. I'm like, dude, did you go practice already? He's about it on and off the field.
A guy that is infatuated with football, right? And infatuated with the extra work. There's probably not a day that goes by that Dillon's not in the weight room getting bonus work, doing extra rehab, getting extra film. His intelligence, all those things are really picking up, establishing some standards for the DB group and how they're going to operate. I think he's done a great job of that, and I know he's not satisfied.
You've got a very young defensive back group. I mentioned at the top of this. These are guys that are experienced where there's inexperience, and I'm really looking for, because there's talent all over the place in this defensive backfield right now. I'm really looking forward to having Dillon Thieneman in this group and having these younger guys learn from him, especially the guys next to him at safeties. Guys like your Kingston Lopez and your Peyton Woodyards that are really going to be entering their first season of significant playing time for this Oregon Ducks football program. Man, having Boettcher and Thieneman as leaders and as all Big Ten type of guys at these 2 positions, it just gets me more excited and more excited about what this defense could look like in 2025. How terrible is the college football calendar having the spring transfer portal open when it is in the midst of spring practice before a lot of spring games are going on, but we know how terrible the calendar is in multiple college sports, like the basketball transfer portal opening like after the Sweet 16. What are we doing? But hey, we got to live in the present. We got to live in the right here and the right now. It is spring portal season. And here's the first thing that I want to say as it pertains to the spring transfer portal outlook for the Oregon Ducks. Folks, less is more. As it stands right now, this is a conference championship roster. This is a college football playoff roster. This is a roster that could grow into a national championship roster. There are other teams out there that are in playoff contention, Big Ten championship contention, SEC championship contention, things like that need to go into the spring portal and get better at certain spots where there's sizable question marks. The Oregon Ducks are not one of those teams. It's the mark of the fantastic roster building that Dan Lanning has been able to do so far, how he's been able to recruit the guys that he got in the winter transfer portal period. Like right now, Oregon is sitting with 110 players, 5 players over that roster limit that's going to be implemented this season. Whoever 5 it is, whether it's low-level guys, former walk-on type of guys, or whether it's some other players that we'll get to that people have heard of, we'll get to that here in just a minute. No matter who it is, if 5 guys transfer out of this program that aren't super significant starters, and Oregon adds a grand total of 0 players in the transfer portal, perfect. I'm going to take that every day of the week. All of that being considered, let's get into some guys that can maybe transfer out of the program. And I guess, what position groups that they could focus on in terms of transfer additions. Now, when I'm putting this graphic together, as you see, for those of you that are watching on YouTube, I did forget about one thing. I did forget about a quarterback. That, I talked to Justin Hopkins about this when I had him on, and he kind of felt very similar to this as well. And I've talked to other people that say, hey, maybe this is something to certainly watch out for. It's Austin Novosad. Austin Novosad could be a starting quarterback at over 100 programs nationwide right now. Like, we saw him spin the ball during last year's spring game. Like, he is a really good quarterback. But he's a really good quarterback where you're going to have a great to elite quarterback in Dante Moore. Okay? So Austin is in an interesting situation. After this season is completed, he's going to have 2 years of eligibility remaining. I think if there's a team out there that really wants to get better, that really throws a high money offer towards Austin Novosad's way, I think that might be considered right now. Because he's a guy that I think can certainly elevate a football team. Like, I'm going to stay within, maybe my expertise outside of Oregon. It's the Big Ten, of course. I look at a program like Minnesota. If Minnesota, I know they got their own quarterback that they feel really good about, that was like a 3-star recruit, something like that. But if they added Austin Novosad to their roster, that could be a 9 or a 10 win team. Whereas right now, Minnesota might be like a 7 to an 8 win team. I feel very, very strongly about that. If you've got a football team that maybe is a quarterback away, Austin Novosad is a guy that could maybe fill that gap. Now, I have a feeling that Austin is probably going to see it through this year, right? Unless he gets an offer that he cannot refuse, as they say within this spring transfer portal period. Because I still think there's a scenario where Dante Moore absolutely balls out this year, maybe a Heisman winner, maybe really close, and he really vaults up at the top to the NFL draft boards, and he only plays 1 year. And now Austin Novosad can kind of be that bridge and that gap quarterback before you get to somebody like maybe a Jared Curtis, maybe a Ryder Lyons, maybe someone like an Achilles Smith Jr., a younger quarterback, certainly down the road. So I bet he's kind of seen how things play out with Dante Moore. If he does come back for a second year, then maybe that's where you could see him transfer out of this program with 2 years left. This is he's a redshirt sophomore coming in this season. But it's certainly something to watch out for. And if they do indeed lose Austin Novosad, what do they do at the backup quarterback position? Okay? Because you got, Luke Moga that's on the roster, Achilles Smith Jr., or maybe some candidates to be in that backup role. How confident are they in those guys? Do they go out into the portal and get a more experienced backup option that they feel a little bit better with? That's maybe something that they could explore as well. The running back room is loaded. Okay? It's loaded with veterans at the top. It's loaded with really good young players at the bottom as well. Like, you're going to have Mekhi Hughes, Noah Whittington, and Dink Riggs probably as a 3-headed monster in the backfield for the Ducks this season. But there's 2 guys in here where I got a feeling, considering that their eligibility clock continues to tick down, that maybe we could see one of them transfer out. I'm talking about Jaden Lamar, and I'm talking about Jay Harris. Now, I just know Jay Harris just transferred in before last season. But, one of these guys is either going to be RB4B, that's a mouthful, or running back 5. On this team. And don't forget what you have below them in Jordan Davison, and then you look at De'Aaron Hill, 2 4-star running backs that I think have a really good future and have a bright future here at Oregon. So, I mean, you kind of look at next year, Hughes is going to be gone, most likely. You're going to have Whittington is going to be gone. So maybe one of these guys could be like the 1B or the backup role with someone like Dink Riggs, and maybe they could compete with him for the RB1 type of role. But then we kind of look at what's below them. I mentioned those 2 young running backs. You're going to have a great true freshman coming in 26 in Tredarian Ball. There's a lot coming up, and there's maybe limited spaces kind of at the top as it pertains to this year and as it pertains to the future. So it would not surprise me to see one of these guys transfer out. Jay Harris has already burned his red shirt. Jaden Lamar can redshirt. I like the skill set that both of these guys certainly provide. I would love to have both of them to have just this insane amount of depth in the running back room, But considering the current state of college football, it would not surprise me to see one of these guys transfer out as when all is said and done. Another room that's really deep, really young, really exciting is wide receiver. When you look at wide receiver, of course, Evan Stewart and DeCorian Moore are the first two names that are coming out of your mouth. But everybody's focused on this wide receiver 3 battle. It's going to be a very fun, very exciting battle throughout spring camp, summer, and of course, into fall camp as well. Some of the first names that come out of your mouth and people's mouth, not just me, about this wide receiver 3 position: Jeremiah McClellan, Kyler Casper, Justice Lowe, Malik Benson is transferred in. Like, that's 4 guys right there. Those are usually 4 of the first names that are mentioned with that wide receiver 3 battle. You know what's one name that's generally not mentioned, or at least mentioned a little bit later in that conversation? Former 5-star wide receiver Jurian Dickey. He's battled with injuries, has not seen the field a ton during his Oregon career, and you kind of had guys who have come in later into the program leapfrog him on the depth chart. It wouldn't be the most surprising thing in the world to see him transfer out. Like, if in the spring you kind of see like, oh, he's wide receiver 6, he's wide receiver 7. Like, eventually I think he's going to have to get on the field, whether it's at Oregon or whether it's somewhere else, to really prove that he can still be that type of 5-star talent like he was coming out of high school. Gary Bryant Jr. is another one. You know, I just talked about him as an underrated guy kind of coming in. He's another guy that's been banged up a little bit over his career. He's had good production when he's been healthy, but he could be another guy that could be buried underneath kind of a lot of these young players right now. And maybe if he wants one more opportunity to compete elsewhere, and really put up some good production and keep his career going in a positive direction, maybe he could end up transferring somewhere. I would love to have him in the room just for his experience and being able to kind of coach up these young guys a little bit, being a coach on the field. So portal needs. This is a playoff roster. Said it at the beginning. I think this is a championship type of roster with what they have right now. But things that I could possibly see. Linebacker depth. We know Boettcher and probably Devin Jackson are going to be the top 2 linebackers on this football team right now. But where does the coaching staff in a couple of weeks, when the spring portal opens, how do they feel about Jerry Mixon? How do they feel about Braden Platt? How do they feel about Dillon Williams? How do they feel about Kamar Matudi? How do they feel about some of these guys? Do they think that there's going to be a significant drop-off when Boettcher and Jackson step off the field? If so, do they pursue some transfer linebacker depth so when they do step off the field that there's not that much of a drop-off? I think there's going to be at least a couple of guys in this room that are valuable and capable depth pieces, but that's certainly something to keep in mind. Offensive line depth is another thing. Like, I know Charlie Pickard is probably slotting in there as that backup center. Remember, Charlie was the center before Poncho took over last year when Oregon was having some of their offensive line problems. So, you know, you look at the depth, I think, right now, outside of that right guard spot where I have Iuli and or Bedford, you know, it was like last year. I know you have Janoris Wilson over there at right tackle, but there might be or 2 maybe transfer offensive linemen that they look for to really build some really good depth. Now, I kind of like some of these freshmen, like Addison. I like Utu, as depth. I think these are really talented players that they're going to expect to learn this year and really maybe develop into starting roles next year. So that's going to be an interesting thing and how they feel about the depth on the offensive line. And that's it. I kind of went through this depth chart and I really looked at it in depth. I'm like, I don't see it happening. They're already over that roster limit. I don't think there's going to be a ton of players that transfer out of this program, beyond those 5 that they need to transfer out to get down to that 105 mark. This is an Oregon team that is sitting extremely pretty right now. Less is more. In just 3 years leading this football program, Dan Lanning has fielded some excellent football teams. But man, this 2025 roster, maybe now I'm just ingrained in it a little bit more and I get a little bit excited, maybe a little bit more. But man, this roster, I think, has the potential to be the best team of the Dan Lanning era. And it starts with the man himself, Dan Lanning. He has grown as a head coach, and he has improved as a head coach every single season. Of course, it started in 2022. That kind of bled into 2023, where a little bit of the narrative was, well, Dan's having a tough time beating his rivals on the West Coast. Of course, a handful of losses. What was it? 3 consecutive losses to the Washington Huskies. That 2022 loss to Oregon State as well. And then you look fast forward to 2024, and he took care of that. He took care of that real quick, and Oregon has established themselves as that team out west. Like, put the future aside, right here and right now, Oregon is the premier program on the West Coast of the United States of America, and Dan Lanning has been able to continually build that. I feel like this year, in year 4, he's really starting to build in that elite era. Like, there have been lessons, I think, that have been learned throughout each of the years, and Dan Lanning has done a really good job in being able to correct those errors. Like, you look at the 2024 season, they came into a new conference. Like, they fell short of conference championships in 2022 and 2023, and then all you do is you jump in to maybe the premier conference in America, and you win the whole damn thing in year number 1, but I think he kind of learned at the end of the season, you got to be playing your best football. Like, you look at the end of 2024, they had that tight game on the road against Wisconsin. Injuries or not, I think Tez Johnson was out for that game. You got to beat that Wisconsin team more than 3 points. But hey, that's life in the Big Ten Conference. Sometimes you have games like that. You look at the Big Ten championship game where, it was certainly not their best defensive effort, although they won the game against Penn State. And then, of course, we know what happened in that game at the Rose Bowl against Ohio State. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned. But I think if you keep on climbing up the ladder, I think last year it was a Big Ten championship team, and it was a really, really good football team. But I think certainly the goal for this team, and I think it's more about the build and how this team is built with a lot of this young recruited talent that has higher ceilings. And I think that's what excites me most. I think in some of these areas with some of these players with Oregon's 2025 roster, and why I think why I think this team has a case to be the best team of the Dan Lanning era, because there's been transfers added at some of these spots, because that's what you need to do when you're kind of building a program and you're kind of changing the mold and you're changing the traits of what you want certain players and certain position groups to look like. But now, not only do I feel like Dan Lanning has kind of learned the lessons over the years, and this is a year that I feel like is really the start of his elite era at Oregon. I also feel that because now you're starting to see these 4-star guys, these 5-star guys, they've built the program. Okay, Will Stein is the offensive coordinator. Tosh Lupoi is the defensive coordinator. They're looking for certain guys with certain traits. Now they have those guys on the team that have higher ceilings. We've seen some of these transfer guys, and they've said as much as well. Like the guys that are now departing the program, like at corner, for example, the Nico Reeds and the Jabbar Muhammads. Good players, but in the future, starting with this 2025 season, right, there might be higher ceilings for the players that are going to be playing those specific positions. I think a big thing for the coaching staff as well is just the cohesiveness and the stability of this coaching staff as well. I think if you continue to stack years on top of each other with familiar position coaches and familiar coordinators, like this would be year 3 upcoming here of Will Stein as the OC. Tosh Lupoi, of course, has been around. Tony Tuioti is the D-line coach on the offensive side of the football. Okay, we know the Will Stein offenses have been some of the best offenses in all of college football. And this is not the first time I've said this, and this is not the first time that maybe other people from a national landscape have said this. I think you have a really good package with Oregon's offense, but I look at the personnel at some of these positions on offense, and I think you're going to unleash a whole new level of offensive football, which is certainly saying something, considering the numbers and the production that this team certainly put up in 2023. I feel the explosiveness just jumps off the page, maybe like it hasn't before, with this Oregon team. Yes, I know you've had Tez Johnson. Yeah, I know the season 2023 with Troy Franklin. Yes, I know Bo Nix and all of that. But at wide receiver, I think Evan Stewart is playing in a position that he's more comfortable with. It sounds like he would be playing more as the inside wide receiver, and DeCorian Moore, of course, coming in. In 2023, we had Troy Franklin and Tez Johnson as two 1,000-yard wide receivers. I think those two aforementioned guys could certainly be in that mold. And then, of course, the talent that is Dante Moore. I think a lot of people look at Dante and they look at that film at UCLA, which certainly had its highs and certainly had its lows. But they look at that with Dante and be like, ooh, that wasn't that great. I'm like, ooh, he was also a true freshman that particular season. But he's what now, 3 years removed from high school football? I think him sitting and learning, being in this program last season is going to have a bigger effect than some people think. Because I think if he would have stayed, well, he maybe wouldn't have stayed at UCLA because Chip Kelly wasn't going to be the coach there anymore. But if he would have went somewhere else and then went to Oregon, I think that it would have been more detrimental towards the development of Dante Moore. But he made a really good decision to come here and learn because, I think he knew all along Oregon was going to be the best place for his development. He got a little bit skittish when Kenny Dillingham left. I'm sure UCLA did some really good things for him, certainly financially. But I think his arm talent, he's got the highest ceiling of an Oregon quarterback. And maybe this is me looking through green and yellow colored glasses. It could possibly be, and being the ultimate optimist. But considering that he's pretty far removed from high school, considering that he learned within this offense, some of the things that his teammates have said, like he can be a Heisman Trophy contender. He has a lot of traits in his arm talent and his ability that other Oregon quarterbacks, just plain and simple, have not had. I think you're going to unleash the explosive play more than we have seen with Oregon football, certainly in the past. Kenyon Sadiq is another one. Hey, I haven't talked about him in a few shows. Kenyon Sadiq. I'm happy that I get to talk about him again. Terrence Ferguson is going to go down as one of the best tight ends in Duck history. But, man, Kenyon Sadiq, just his uniqueness as a weapon, I think opens things up a lot more with him. Don't sleep on Jamari Johnson transferring in certainly as well. I just think it's just the hallmark of what Oregon is building right now, where you just continue to expand on some of these high ceilings and these best ever type of talents. And I think certainly these guys provide that. The running back room is loaded. Okay, you had Bucky Irving in 2022 and 2023. He had back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons. You had Jordan James, Noah Whittington certainly in there as well. But I don't think you've ever had a running back room this loaded. With Mekhi Hughes, who very well could be the most talented back of the Lanning era. Hey, Bucky Irving was pretty damn good. He did pretty damn good in the NFL in his rookie season as well. But we know what Whittington can provide. And Dink Riggs, man, he is getting all that hype. I think you've got a true three-headed monster in the backfield with Poncho and Pranon. I think you've got really good interior offensive line blocking and guys that can really pave the way for this run game. I just kind of look around at this whole thing, and I think, and I've said this many times before, I think this offense is going to be, production-wise, maybe more like 2023 than it was in 2024. But I think this offense in 2025, it's going to be, offense is never going to be a problem for Oregon. I think the thing for me that maybe really takes it over the top, that I'm very excited about, is defense. And I think that the secondary, that has been just a heartbreaking weak link in some of these big games over the last 2 years. You look at Washington, and they just couldn't cover those receivers in the Pac-12 title game. Of course, we all know what happened. Defensive backs getting turned around, out of position in the Rose Bowl in that quarterfinal matchup. Dillon Thieneman coming in and being the best safety since Javon Holland, being the best defensive back since Christian Gonzalez, I think is going to help a lot. And I've talked about this on this show before of what he can do and really setting the standard and showing guys how to prepare like a professional and having all of these young guys around him. And I look at some of the traits of some of these young guys. A lot of people, whether it's been press conferences, whether it's been other people I've talked to, Ife Obadegwu has freakish athletic ability. And a lot of people love him. Maybe Jaleel Florence, possibly coming off of an injury as well. Dalen Austin plugging into that nickel spot. And you combine these transfers with Jaden Kennedy and Theron Johnson. I just think I put it all together. I think there's a lot of those elite traits, the length, the range that Oregon has been looking for in the secondary. There are guys that check those boxes. And I think that there is really good depth here in the secondary. You got to look at a guy that's 6'5" in Kingston Lopa that could be back there playing safety next to Dillon Thieneman. And if it's not Lopa, it's Woodyard. That's some pretty good depth at the safety position. And we know what's out there at corner, and we know what's out there at nickel. Alone, if the secondary can play on a much better level, this is a football team that's going to be much better, especially towards the end of the season. I don't think you're going to see the 2025 team come out and just kick the door down right away. I think the offensive line is going to have to gel together. These young guys in the secondary, like I just talked about, they're going to have to figure it out. But for me, I think this team is built to be strong at the end of the year. This team is built where some of these young players, they get to game 6, they get to game 7, they get to November, they get to game 8, they get to game 9, they get to game 10. That's where things, okay, now they are a little bit more familiar. Now you're really starting to see that skill set really unleashed, whereas maybe you didn't see that in that first couple of games where they're still kind of figuring things out. Where you combine the veteran presence with the young players, I am extremely, extremely excited. And you have guys like a Mateo and a Bear and a Mari and Bryce in that front group that we know can be all Big Ten type of players. The defense really starts to have me excited. And you have a head coach in Dan Lanning that is a defensive guy at heart. And I think he knows, he's loved what the offense is certainly doing right now, but he knows in his heart of hearts to win a championship, you need a great defense. And I think the thing that sets this 2025 team possibly apart and makes a case for this 2025 team is this defense. I'm feeling more comfortable each day that goes by that this is going to be the best defense of the Dan Lanning era. Coming back and circling back to the secondary and talking about Dillon Thieneman right now. When you look at past safeties, you look at Evan Williams, who's a 4th or 5th round draft pick. You look at a guy like a Steve Stevens. You look at a Tysheem Johnson. You look at a Kobe Savage. All due respect to those guys, they filled a role, and some filled it well. But Dillon Thieneman has taken this thing to another level. These guys that are coming in here, specifically at safety, are taking it to another level and other parts of the defensive backfield. And I think considering the way the last 2 seasons ended, having that shirt up and having that unit potentially playing as well as they could be playing towards the end of the 2025 season, maybe that alone could really make this team the best team of the Dan Lanning era in 2025. I think there's a lot to certainly be excited about, and there's a lot that could make a case for 2025 being the best team. This team just continues to climb the ladder. The elephant in the room, and this elephant has been in the room for a couple of months now since January. Wait a minute. I recognize that guy. Isn't that Big Ten Ted? Wait a minute. This is an Oregon Ducks specific show. Didn't he say he liked Wisconsin growing up? Yes, I know. There are some questions that certainly deserve some answers, and I'm here to answer them for you. Usually when people start a show, they come out and say, hey, this is who I am, this is who we are, and this is what we're going to do. Well, I just get out and do it right away. A couple of days after New Year's, did that show on Jaran Kavawe, Sagapulatele, transferring and got with it. But now I'm a couple of months have gone by. I've seen some stuff certainly pop up in the comments, and I figured that I would address it right now. The first rule in content creation no matter if you're a teenage TikToker or you're a college football analyst, give the people what they want. It was not only this season covering Oregon on the Big Ten TED side, but it was before this season. It was even going back to 2023 when I did special coverage of some Pac-12 games, and I already saw that this Oregon fan base was a very hungry fan base for really some sort of content. And look, I've had fan bases out there, the Michigans of the world, the Nebraskas of the world, certainly not the Ohio States of the world, but I've had fan bases over there that have watched my content over the Big Ten TED side for, quite a bit. But I did not have a fan base quite like the Oregon Ducks that engaged as much as they did, and I think that appreciated what I was able to put out. And I'm very, very thankful for those comments. I remember in the middle of last season putting out a tweet that said, hey, the way this thing is going, maybe I should look into doing this Oregon thing fairly full time. And that's where the ball really got rolling. That's where people said, oh, this is great. You should think about doing this. I got some direct messages and I'm like, oh, dude, you should totally do it. You should totally do it. And that's when really the wheels got turning in my head of what would eventually become that show out west. So that's really the initial basis of this whole thing as well. And then I think over the last couple of years, I've made more connections in the Oregon media space than I ever did. You're dating back to 2020 when I started over on the Big Ten TED side. Like, I've made very good relationships with the three guys. You just saw Justin Hopkins and Max Torres on this show. I've been talking to them for a handful of years. Like, my first exposure to Oregon in the media space was the QB11 show, right? I had Doug on when Oregon first joined the Big Ten, and I've been on that show twice. I've been on the show with Scott Reed at the Rivals Network as well. Of course, you can't talk about connections and shows without talking about Sports Chat 503, one of my favorite communities, certainly out there. And we made a lot of connections, and there were a lot of similarities, I think, between myself and the Oregon fan base, certainly as well. Look, when people get into content creation, I think certain people do it for certain reasons. I started my career out of college as a TV sports reporter in Fargo, North Dakota, covering like North Dakota State football, University of North Dakota hockey. And I really started Big Ten TED because I, for stability reasons, got out of that news business and that sports reporting business and kind of went to behind the camera. I'm working in live sports production certainly right now, but I just wanted to itch to really get back into reporting and really get back into talking about the sport that I truly do love. And Big Ten TED allowed me to do that. And then I saw some opportunities within the space and the connections that I made within the Oregon space certainly as well. Now, I know a lot of you also might be thinking, well, if you want to do a team-specific show, why didn't you do it on Wisconsin, the team that you ended up cheering for and the team that you ended up liking when you were growing up? Here's the thing I will say about that. And I will kind of give you a background on football fandom within the Dairy State. I liked Wisconsin. I don't know if I loved them or was a diehard Badger fan, certainly growing up. Like, Packers, yeah, that's a little bit of a different story. I think I was maybe more of a diehard Packer fan than I was a Wisconsin Badger fan growing up, even though I loved college football more. Like, there'd be like, I grew up in a Catholic household. Like, Notre Dame would be on as much as Wisconsin. I've only been to 3 Wisconsin Badger games in my life, and it happened during, I think, like a 2 to 3 year span, certainly as well. So I think for a long time, I was like fairly homeless as far as like diehard college football fandom. Now, one of these other points that I want to make, I remember turning on the TV in 2007. It was the very first game ever broadcasted on the Big Ten Network, was Michigan's loss to the Mountaineers of Appalachian State, one of the biggest upsets in college football history. And I remember thinking to myself, oh man, I got to watch what happens next week to Michigan, how they respond from this. You know who they played? Dennis Dixon and the Oregon Ducks. Now, I grew up in a fairly old school tradition, maybe as a part of my life when I was younger. All right, when I played high school football, we ran split back veer triple option football. If we threw it 10 times in a game, that was considered a pass happy day at the office. Wisconsin ran I formation, 2 tight ends. And growing up, I was one that was maybe a little bit rebellious. I like to buck tradition, right, in a few other ways, certainly as well. And football was no different. I remember watching that game, seeing what Michigan would do, and then I saw Oregon just take it to them at the Big House in Ann Arbor. And I remember watching that game with the speed white uniforms. I remember the Jonathan Stewart and Dennis Dixon, of course, and the performance in the Big House in that game. I remember the offense. I remember all of these things, and I remember being like, whoa, that right there, that's cool. That's cool. And ever since then, I've been a follower of this team. I still don't think I've earned to call myself a fan of this team. I think that takes years of significant investment. So I'm hoping to work my way up to that point. But man, I've been a follower of this team ever since then. You see this shirt right here? I got this shirt during their 2010 season, the 2010 run to the national championship game. Were they maybe my number one watch during a given week? Maybe not, but they were certainly in the top 3 every single week. Ever since then, I really wanted to see what that Oregon football program was doing week by week by week. My last point in why this show exists, because I felt like it. And I think that this is like a general maybe lesson of life, or maybe something to really keep in mind with life in general. Do things that you enjoy. And don't be out there constantly trying to make maybe everybody else happy. Your joy and your happiness, I believe, it is what is truly important. And I was having so much fun during this last season covering Oregon, I'd had so much fun really watching their games, maybe more than any other team that I've watched since Big Ten 10 started in 2020 and 2021. And then I had so much fun interacting with some of the fans. Man, I really started a connection with some fans certainly out there, and we formed some really good and really fun relationships as well when I kind of appeared on some of these other shows as well during the season. I remember when I was kind of going back and forth whether I wanted to do this thing. I remember sitting there watching the Rose Bowl. I remember in the den just over here. I remember the spot that I was sitting in, and I remember when the tally started to go up for Ohio State, and then the goose egg remained on the board for the Oregon Ducks, sitting there being like top 5, well, maybe not top 5, like top 7 most like shocked and like just bummed out that I've ever been. Like I was reeling from that from like a week. That's when I knew, when I'm like, I'm invested. I'm bought in. I care. And like, this is something that I just didn't want to do willy-nilly. This is not something that I wanted to do at some point and then cancel it a month later or 2 months later. This is not something, I know a lot of people out there are going to say jumping on the bandwagon. I get it, and maybe there's a little bit of truth to that. But I wanted to make sure that if I did something like this, it was indeed the right decision. It was indeed something that I truly was passionate about. It was something that I truly cared about. And it was truly something that I wanted to invest in long term. And when I was watching that Rose Bowl, and when I was having that feelings, and I did not even have close to feelings of jumping ship at that point. When I felt that, I'm like, I'm bought in. I'm invested. I'm flying with this flock. Maybe I'm not a true full member of the flock right now, but I'm flying. And my wings and the feathers are kind of growing a little bit. So it was at that moment I'm like, yeah, I want to do this. I want to do this. And I want to make this thing really good, and I want to put as much effort into it as I totally can. I have had so much fun doing this, focusing in on this program, continuing to interact with the fan base out there. They have been nothing but great to me. I am so excited to see the facilities and the state this summer. I am bought in, as if there may have been no doubt to begin with. but I am completely bought in. And that kind of gives you maybe a little bit of a background, maybe a little bit of an explanation of things as they currently stand right now. Like already in a short period of time, I think I've made a good amount of progress and a good amount of connections. Imagine if we do this thing 2 years down the road, 3 years down the road, 4 years down the road, where this thing would go. I am extremely excited about the future, and I'm glad to be here talking Oregon Ducks football on a week-by-week basis. Oh, man, it's been so much fun. It's been so much fun covering this program, and we got a long ways to go until this thing kicks off against Montana State in the fall, but we don't have that much further to go until the spring game at the end of the month. We're going to have this thing covered wall to wall. Until next time, I'm Ted LeBrew. This has been That Show Out West.